Okay, we were recording, y'all. We are recording. Let me turn off my vocal monitor. I don't need it in my ears. Okay, welcome, everyone, to the first in a minute of another video lecture from me, another pre recorded little thing for y'all. Today, we are going to talk about Japanese aesthetics in the avant-garde and how much of it relates to a lot of pretty old ideas in Japan dating back centuries, some ancient aesthetics, if you will. And a lot of it has to do with a lot of political means, sort of rejecting status quo political situations in the modern age of Japan. We're going to get into a few different groups of artists, some of which are pretty actively trying to, utilize some ancient aesthetics in their new considered avant-garde sound art, performance, experimental music, etc., etc. We're going to be listening to some artists that are actively trying to reject modernity through modernity of the post-war era in hyper-industrialized capitalist Japan. We're going to be listening to some of their works and how they confront this through physical violence and very extreme performance methods. And then we're going to talk about, wrapping it up, some artists that seem to bridge a lot of the two between, kind of ancient, spacious aesthetics with new technologies that they aren't trying to create necessarily abrasive aesthetic, even though it might be very loud and very, considered noise music to the Western ear. We're going to let this stuff define itself. So we're going to be talking, to wrap it up, about a few artists that utilize new technologies and industrial ideas to sort of deconstruct them in a very graceful way rather than a violent way. So that we're going to kind of put it into three categories there. But first, before we do any of that, just to give you guys a little bit of background on, modern Japanese history as well as ancient Japanese aesthetics, because, it's not a given that we all know this stuff. I'll start with a nice quote from Masami Akita, aka Merzbo, to roll us out. Sometimes I want to kill the new noisy Japanese with my noise. The effects of modern Japanese culture are too much everywhere. I want to create silence out of my noise. Very interesting, if especially for those that know of Merzbo's work. It is definitely anything but silent. But Japan in general, I would say in the modern era, post-war era, I would say has had the most sort of drastic shifts in physical and cultural landscapes by the end of World War II. Because obviously, as we know, we dropped 2 nuclear bombs on Japan, which very physically altered the landscape here, but sort of culminated this, a very, very, long period of, obviously Imperial Japan in the modern era was its own sort of defining era, but this idea of, divinity and the emperor, and nationalism through, military might and strength. That's something that goes back a long ways, So with the sort of dropping of the A-bombs, this really brought an end to that cultural landscape and brought forth a very hyper westernized replacement, because obviously the West was super involved in Japanese politics and culture moving forward after the war. So these, crazy conclusions to the war, which was specific only to Japan, really led to a new capital-centric identity, and that led to an era that many people refer to as the post-war Japanese economic miracle. we could say this era was from the 1950s all the way through the 1980s. You see a crazy boost in industrial and technological manufacturing patents coming out of Japan. Manufacturing becomes a huge part of the economy, and it completely reshapes the output of the exporting culture of Japan and brings it into this westernized capitalist world, but in a very quick, hyperactive way of adapting to this system and flourishing as far as the industrial and manufacturing executives and ruling class was concerned. So it's a crazy contrast between pre and during World War II Japan to 40 years later, where you have a complete night and day. What was an imperialist and almost isolationist sort of nationalist economy has, become so dependent on this, in this case, hyper-capitalist trade, which, is only found during this post-war economic miracle, if you want to call it that. So there was a bit of a rebuttal artistically, though, to this hyper-capitalist system. There was a bunch of different, obviously, avant-garde art had existed in the Western world, what we consider avant-garde art, what we consider experimental noise music, things like that. It did exist in the pre-war era of Europe, and then, expanding to the Western world, both in underground art circles and academia in the post-war era. Of course, Japan had a bit of a different reaction due to the uniqueness of their post-war situation, and their noise avant-garde, what would be called by the West as Japanoise, in a lot of ways. We'll call it just Japanese noise music in Japan, and the avant-garde in Japan kind of went through a few different identity crises, because how couldn't you, when your entire country shifts so drastically in your lifetime? These artists in the mid 20th century to late 20th century, they're sort of, I guess, juggling between, like, how do we retain this old identity without becoming hyper nationalists like we used to be, but also how do we take advantage of our technological expertise as a way of criticizing the hyper-westernized sort of new country that we now all live in Japan. So there's a few different ideological, artistic ideas in the avant-garde and different movements that sort of push back or embrace old ideas, push back on old ideas, just give and push back on new ideas to give some sort of fresh start, ideological clean slate that rejects both the ancient and the modern. And then there are those that embrace both. So we're going to talk about all of that. So that's what this little intro section, just giving you an idea of what we're going to be talking about in this sort of video lecture that we're doing right now. We're going to keep it within an hour. I'm not going to drive you crazy. I'm not going to drive myself crazy. I don't want to talk for more than an hour straight. That is crazy. So now that you guys got a little historical background from the political, cultural, and then artistic landscape, let's talk about, we got to introduce some of these ancient Japanese aesthetics to the conversation, just so you guys know. We will be mentioning a few of these terms. As you guys know, like, there's a very traditional aesthetic to Japan that is well known in our modern educated landscape, where we can go to museums and see this sort of stuff, and it's in movies. We know about samurai, we know about lots of Zen Buddhism, Confucianism, Shintoism. These are all spiritual movements that took a very deep cultural root in Japan and impacted all aspects of life, including the arts. Here's a little quote here from Gunter Kitsch, who wrote a scholarly paper called Ma, Place, Space, and Void for the Kyoto Journal. My voice is cracking. Gunter Kitsch writes, "It must be stressed that a sense of place does not negate an objective awareness of the static or homogeneous quality of topological space. Rather, it infuses the objective space with an additional subjective awareness of lived, existential, non-homogeneous space." So what he's trying to say here is this idea of, in this case, the first on our list of aesthetic, ma, negative space, is this idea that we, attribute an idea of spaciousness to our personal lives, to the objects that we encounter in our lives. It is an awareness of spaciousness. And obviously you can see much of that seen in, calligraphy, in the visual arts, ancient visual arts of Japan in different eras, all the way up to the Tokugawa era, woodblock paintings, this idea, it's a proto-ancient minimalism that comes through a aesthetic tool, in this case what we call ma, negative space, that applies to all aspects of life. All of these aesthetics you're going to see come up in social, cultural, political landscapes. These are all terms that, those in Japan that are aware of the ancient ways might be very culturally and personally conscious of in their day-to-day lives. So, ma, negative space, to give space to various aspects of one's life, whether it be the people in your life, different animals, nature, everyday objects, This is all coming from Shintoism, Confucianism, and Zen Buddhist ideas that have been passed down and turned into less of a spiritual practice and more of a personal practice that relates to just your day-to-day life and culture. Another term here, mano no aware, being aware of things, or to be mindful of one's surroundings at all times. Mindfulness is what the Western modern white world would call this, but again, we have this in Japan for centuries. Wabi, subdued or austere beauty, which served as a direct influence to the minimal elements of traditional Japanese visual art, fashion, dance, and poetry. Poetry, another big one, haikus, right? How much more minimal can you get? How much more wabi can you get than something like poetry in Japan, talking about haikus, talking about in dance and theater, no theater, kabuki. If you see these performances, there is so much slowness, gradual change that allows you to take in these small little austere, subdued beauties, as it's written here. Sabi, to go encounter with wabi, wabi-sabi. Sabi, to age with grace, a concept illustrated in everything from 14th century architecture to poetic narratives on literal topic of aging alone. This is about respecting the idea of aging with grace, of changing, of moving with your mortality, the mortality of things, accepting it and seeing the beauty in that. Yugen, to carry oneself with profound grace, which is a direct influence on the traditional and methodical performance mediums such as kabuki and no theater, as well as gagaku, court music ensemble performances. We're not going to be listening to any gagaku today, but definitely check that stuff out because it is super methodical, super precise. It is very, very graceful, and it's visually beautiful to look at, these ensembles as well. Same goes, like I had mentioned, for kabuki and no theater. They have serious movement, style, swagger in all things related to their movement and their presentation. Iki, Refined structure and style, continuing on in this idea, a deciding factor in Japan's emphasis on perfection in one's craft, seen everywhere from the martial arts of the Tokugawa era all the way up to today's Yamaha's new line of robotic toilets. Everything has to be refined, clean, stylish. This is all this goes back 1,000 years. You must create something and pride yourself in perfection in the structure of what you create. So this is something that is obviously, as we all know in mainstream Japanese culture, the cleanliness compared to American cities and American cultures and Western cultures in general is very different. This is something that goes all the way back to Ikki. And the last bit here, kirei. Allowing change in one's life or environment to be an inevitable one that should be embraced rather than veered away from. That's beautiful, accepting change and utilizing change as part of your day-to-day life. So this is what we're talking about here when we talk about ancient Japanese aesthetics, because when we start talking about new ideas in avant-garde performance that's starting to come out in the 20th century in Japan, it's not necessarily new in aesthetic, sonically, in different ways, performance-wise. We're going to hear new sounds, but conceptually, so much of this music is in direct response to these ancient aesthetics, whether we see them as a positive in some ways or a negative in other ways. So here's a little quote here from a Stanford philosophy professor, Graham Parks, talking about the idea of change in Japanese philosophy. So classical Japanese philosophy understands the basic reality as constant change. The world of flux that presents itself to our senses is the only reality. The arts in Japan have traditionally reflected this fundamental impermanence, sometimes lamenting, but often more celebrating and embracing it. The arts in Japan have always tended to be closely connected with Confucian practices of self-cultivation. And since the scholar and official in China was expected to be skilled in the 6 arts, culture and the arts tend to be more closely connected with intellect and the life of the mind than in the Western traditions in Japan. So this is the idea of celebrating change and embracing the arts as part of this, day-to-day cultural philosophy of Japan. So we're constantly in Japan post-war. We are seeing an embrace of change, but in going in different directions. Are we going to be entirely westernized and super industrialized and hyper capitalist? Or are we going to embrace the changes that we see now, not necessarily celebrating them, but utilizing these new tools in industries as a way of criticizing them, like destroying it from within in a way? So let's start by talking about some artists that really consciously utilize these ancient ideologies, these ancient aesthetics in Japan, heavily Confucian, heavily Shintoist, heavily Zen Buddhist introductions or influences, but in the context of avant-garde music and performance. So obviously, in the post-war era, here we go. We'll start with a quote from Keiji Hino. We're going to listen to a few artists that are actively embracing a lot of these old ideas. Here's a quote starting with Keiji Hino. Ma, as we talked about, negative space. Ma means the deepest of now. It's not referring to a specific space, but it's about how one can find the deepest present moment and how they can extract it. I like to compare this to the Indian raga. It will always be different. So, applying ma in a musical improvised category is something that someone like Keiji Hino is incredibly conscious of during their performances, which is why their music is always changing. It's always different, whether it's harsh noise, super minimalist guitar work, full rock ensemble playing like crazy like atonal punk music. These are all things that Keiji Hino has dealt with in his career, and it's why the constant change is what makes him so well known in a lot of ways. So backing up, obviously post-war world is full of new sonic ideas, talking about synthesis, musique concrète, atonality in concert music, avant-garde, classical music, listening, the influence of written philosophical works such as Luigi Russollo's The Art of Noises, John Cage's The Future of Music Credo, and Jacques Attali's Noise, The Political Economy of Noises. This idea of utilizing sound, not necessarily traditional musical instruments, but sound in general as music, had become very universal in avant-garde circles worldwide. And Japan is no exception to that case. So with westernization in Japan came introduction of new Western avant-garde concepts, which immediately started influencing the music and art in Japan. Specifically, these terminologies of sound art versus music. Sound art, which is originally coined by Max Neuhaus, refers to sound in space, while music is referred to as sound in time. Take that as you will. Take that from Max Neuhaus. Different artists such as Neuhaus, Lamont Young, Alvin Lucier, we're starting to see different lines being blurred between like art gallery sounds and concert sounds, concert spaces sounds, underground performances versus concert halls, etc., etc. This all has such a huge influence on the Japanese artists of the 60s and 70s who are not necessarily rejecting modern avant-garde ideas, but want to take some of these principles and apply them towards the embracing of ancient methods. How can we make a very much Japanese avant-garde in response to this new Western avant-garde? So different artists such as KJ Hino, Akio Suzuki, Yoshiwata, Tamio Shirashi, these are all artists that consciously talk about embracing ancient aesthetics and concepts such as Ma and Yugen. So we're going to listen to a few of these artists now. Ma is something that this idea of negative space, we're going to hear about it a lot just in silence and utilization of sustain in these artists, drone, spaciousness, things like that. So we're going to start with Tamio Shirashi, who I have a paper on that I published on the Patreon earlier. You can check out. But just to give you a little background on who he is, he's an early collaborator of KJ Hino, who we'll get to. But Tamio's main thing is working nowadays, past 20, 30 years, as a saxophonist, utilizing this very specific, super high frequency, multiphonic dog whistle approach to the alto saxophone. It's a very shrill, extended technique that goes at least 4 octaves above the fundamental valve frequencies of the alto. And while the sounds are very shrill, Shirashi is actively trying to embrace the idea of Ma, spaciousness, mano no aware, being aware of these shrillness of these sounds in every space that they perform in, whether it be a concert hall or the subway. So let's watch a little bit of Tamio performing with KJ Hino. This was from, do we have a year? Do we have a year here? It doesn't look like we have a year. But let's check it out. KG's on vocals. So most certainly not traditionally musical by any jazz or classical saxophonist's means. But almost immediately my brain is brought to kabuki and no theater. The ideas of shrill vocalizations and shrill musical instruments being used, as well as long periods of silence and spaciousness. So let me also look up here just the Tamio in the subway, because it's worth hearing him in a very reverberant environment, because this is one of his main practices, is going out late at night in New York. This is in Soho. It's where he usually resides. 1 a.m. on the E train, 2012. Let's check it out. Look at the dude behind him. It's just like, nah. Had to turn it down. With headphones on right now, I think my cat's going insane listening to this. This mono no aware happening here is happening between Tamio himself and the spaciousness of the Spring Street stop. You know, we're talking about a lack of people. It's 1 a.m. It's basically only him and the tunnel. He's performing the tunnel. He's being one with the tunnel through his extreme saxophone performance. And now you can see the tunnel is being invaded by the oncoming train. And then he begins to play with the noise of the train as some sort of culminating performance. Only a minute and a half long. And he's done. Beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. So, we can obviously talk about, you know, why there might be some sort of, I would say, shrillness and a bit of an off-puttingness to some people in Shirashi's work, but you can immediately trace this stuff to No theater and the shrillness that comes in that. Here's a quote from Naotake Gunji, a musician from Japan, a close friend of mine from Brooklyn College. We studied together. Awesome sound artist from Japan, living in New York now. What Now says, Mr. Gunji says, you'll quickly trace the linkage between No and someone like Shirashi-san. It's all about making this deep listening, no score approach. The performers are required to pay attention to their space and make their optimal decision as when to play again. This is an ancient structured improvisation. Duration of time is inherently long or short, and making this optimal decision when there's very little sound for the preceding 30 seconds is much harder than making a similar decision in a busy ensemble. So, less is more. Less is more. This is what he's talking about here. Sometimes it's just as difficult. So to take a little break from the shrillness and go in a completely opposite direction, in a more micro sound direction, we have someone like Akio Suzuki, who is a instrument builder, sound artist, and performer, improviser, who makes his own acoustic objects that are amplified or not amplified, completely acoustic, that he performs, and this is much quieter, but still very much focusing on negative space and being aware of the spacious surroundings. In this case, he's in a gallery with a lot of people in it, so it requires almost no sound coming from the audience. It's a very quiet recording. I'm going to turn it up here. He's created an instrument, a sort of mallet instrument with pieces of plastic and nails on a block of wood. I don't know why the frame rate is so shitty, but you can hear it. That's most important. Could listen to this stuff all day. In this work, dynamics and subtlety is the most important thing. We could relate this directly back to this, sort of subdued beauty, talking about, and also iki, like the refinement and the wabi, austere, subdued beauty, very small things happening here right now, but we're finding beauty in nails and plastic and wood. It's beautiful, absolutely beautiful, and an artist that actively embraces some ancient ideas. Moving on to Keiji Hino, his work goes from every genre you could possibly think of. In this case, we're going to see a little improvised electronics performance from what year was this? Oh wow, earlier 2020, right before we went into quarantine, February. This is with Russell Haswell as well, but he's off camera. Spaciousness, the name of the game. See how profound him just playing finger drums coming out of nowhere. And then someone completely different sonically, but again, actively embracing traditional aesthetic would be Yoshiwata, who more people would consider a composer's composer, but he's part of the Fluxus movement, does a lot of performance with found objects, but people are following a score. In this case, he has a set of bagpipers who he also plays himself. His son Tashiwata is here, and there's also a percussionist. So let's take a little listen. Air raid siren in his hand. The way that he's actively walking up and down the stage, too, is sort of this idea of ringing a siren into this outdoor concert space, wherever they are. Baldwin Hills Scenic Overlook. Not sure where that is. But this is from 2016. So this is obviously, he's an old guy. He's been doing this since the 60s as part of the Fluxus movement. But he personally has been on record talking about being of the, embracing traditional aesthetics and approach to avant-garde concert music. So now let's go in a direction of the complete rejection of the new and the old. We're talking, of course, about physically violent, confrontational Japanese noise music, capital N noise music. To open up this section, just to give you a little quote about the economics of the 80s in Japan at the end of the miracle era. The short-lived bubble economy at the end of the 80s was a period of collective hysteria, a crazy time of frothy fortunes, pie-in-the-sky projects, lavish living that suddenly evaporated by the end of the decade. The impact of the crash of the stock market and land prices has had a profound consequences, hammering the banks, businesses and investors, borrowers, customers, and eventually employees. So, we're talking about this fake, the fakeness of hypercapitalization caught up to Japan. By the 80s, they are not number one in manufacturing anymore. We're finding cheaper deals in China. They might still have patents coming on the way, but this boom period is coming to an end. If we're talking strictly from this, stock market trade value sort of approach to things. So the economic miracle has ended, and with it, a lot of these ideas in mainstream Japanese culture have become, completely embraced globally at this point. Of course, talking about otaku culture, anime, gaming, even pop music, Japanese pop music, J-pop, things like that. So that's coming from the mainstream of people working within the system. But there are people on the outside, the weirdo musician, the weirdo artists that are not interested in newfound modernity and chicness and this plastic neon world that Japan had become known for worldwide. The idea of noisu, which is what they called noise culture back then, would be the idea of rejecting the newness of Japan, as well as the old nationalist and eventually traditional approaches of Japanese culture, and just trying to create a clean slate. So Japanese noise culture, noisu culture, was first introduced to Western audiences in '94 on the show 120 Minutes with Thurston Moore of Sonic Youth. And he introduced a few different artists. We're going to talk about the artists specifically that are using performance and noisu as a way of physically confronting, violently destroying, or harming oneself or the audience, putting the audience at risk as a way of showing that we reject the new Japan. We know it's going to fall apart. We know that this neon plastic era is going to fall apart, so we are going to cause it now. They are accelerationists in a way by utilizing the industrial junk surrounding them. So let's start with Hana Tarash. Obviously, you guys know Hana Tarash from the bulldozer incident. There's only photographs of that. There is not video, but let's show a little video of him using glass. Hana Tarash, Yamataka Ai, was a day laborer in Japan in the 80s. He was building apartment buildings and working on construction sites. So his access to these tools and his insight of seeing it from the inside, being someone that builds it up, he knows how fake all of it is and how this bubble is going to collapse. So let's watch Hana Tarash in '88. Most likely these are all tools from his job, or materials from his work. So he's using industrial tools, not obviously as sound objects, but more importantly, he's destroying them and utilizing their destruction as the thesis of the project. Destroy this new material. It's not doing the country any good. So two other artists that actively are trying to not necessarily embrace, but utilize the idea of Westernization, in this case, Western music, rock and roll music, the rock and roll influence on Japan, J-rock, J-pop, and things like that. How could they take this and bring it to the extreme? In this case, we have Masan, who considers himself, this project, a rock and roll artist. And he's absolutely, I don't know if you would call it that, but let's let him define himself here and let him talk about why extreme quote unquote rock performance is, how he's trying to create something completely new. Again, incredibly physical, confrontational performances. Just one person in this case. This is from the 120 Minutes episode on MTV. So he's taking the rock and roll frontman to an extreme. There is no instrumentation beyond a microphone, pedals, amplified shaker of some sort of in his hand. This is what he thinks of rock culture in Japan. It's another clip. Performances might last less than a minute. Here's one from 10 years ago. Still at it, in his 50s. Yo, rock fucking god. He's a god. Oh my god. Set is going to be less than a minute. Punches an audience member. Does a nice little pose wearing his leather pants, silk shirt. Incredible. Don't hurt yourself, man. You're pretty old. That's it. He's done. Goodbye. Fucking rock and roll, man. That's what he thinks of rock and roll in this day and age. Another group that would consider themselves a rock and roll group and has created some pretty straight ahead rock at certain points in their career, but in their earliest stages were utilizing the rock band persona as a way of confronting a lot of the repressed homophobia and just sexual repression happening in Japanese culture in general, specifically coming from the gay community, and how there isn't really a openness to gay culture in Japan, especially in the 80s and early 90s. Probably still not so much today either, honestly. But they would... If you've heard the Garo Gara Gay Gay Gays music on record, you know that it's extreme. If you haven't seen the videos of them performing specifically with vacuums on genitals, this is something where they're taking the extremeness that was found in their hidden S&M, very, very underground S&M culture of Japan, and bringing it into the music venue world as a way of basically putting a mirror to Japan and showing, this exists in Japan. We have there's gay culture, there's S&M culture in Japan, and you must be forced to deal with it and can face it. This is what it is. Let's check it out. It's going to be pixelated. That's an amplified vacuum. Rock and roll. This is at a club. They got a backline behind them. They got a drum machine. They got a drum set. They got amps. This is another response to not only new cultural ideas of Japan coming in from the West, but also old repressive ideas in their mind. Incredibly confrontational stuff here. I'll put some links to all these videos if you guys really want to watch all of this, but you get the point. That is Japanese noise coming from the confrontational rejection of the new and rejection of the old, complete destruction in all and everything in their path to create something entirely new, fresh slate. To wrap this up, we will talk about some folks that do embrace the new technology, the modernization of the Western world and its influence in Japan, but also are having embraced some ideas that go very much back to the ancient aesthetics, talking about different artists of the of the no input onkyo scene, folks that utilize new technological tools that have been completely, developed and brought out to the world via Japan. But their ideas that the new identity is the technology of Japan. The new national identity of Japan is the technology itself, and we need to embrace the technology and deconstruct it as a way of showing us via the devices we're using themselves. In this case, turntables and mixers primarily, not records necessarily, and not inputs necessarily. We're talking about just the devices, these technological achievements coming from Pro Audio Japan. How do we embrace this digital modernity through our own patent devices and deconstruct them to create something that might have some sonic similarities to the more traditional sound artist, or the traditional embracing sound artist that I played earlier, as well as, from a philosophical standpoint, embracing the ancient ideas of Japan. So we're going to talk about Atomo Yoshihide, we're going to talk about Sachiko M, and we're going to talk about Toshimaru Nakamura. These are all artists that are associated with the Japanese onkyo scene, utilizing no input mixing techniques named after the onkyo mixer and Pro Audio company. But let's start with Atomo Yoshihide, who is associated with this, but he's much more associated with abstract turntablism, a la Christian Marclay, Maria Chavez, Marina Rosenfeld. But he has a very, very unique approach to it, which is a complete deconstruction of the device. Now we are entirely focused on the technical approach to avant-garde music. How can we take one device, in this case, the Technics 1200, SL1200, how can we turn this into a new instrument? So this is how he does it. As you can tell, shrillness off the top. And yet this is still inherently Japanese to me, because as part of the onkyo movement, you are taking what you are exporting, in this case Pro Audio developed in Japan, and showing us exactly how one would not use it if one was to be using it properly in any sort of mainstream setting. In this case, a DJ. right? Atomo is saying no. I'm going to make it my own. I'm going to make it my own generative music device. Skip ahead a little bit here. Also utilizing feedback and no input of the DJ mixer as well. Pioneer, another Japanese company. And what do we do if we just move? If we are physical with the devices themselves, not destructive. How do we manhandle it gracefully? That's Atomo for you. Let's wrap this up very quickly with some no input music coming from the artists Sachiko M and Toshimaru Nakamura. These are guys that are utilizing no input mixers where you take the aux sends and bring them back into the inputs. You take one output of the mixer, put it into an input, utilize the EQ and the gain trim to create some very, very, very analog, deconstructed oscillations that are not really supposed to happen. That is not what the manufacturer from Japan, Onkyo in this case, what they intended to be to use this device for. So what we have here is a very Japanese, a very mono no aware ma approach to a deconstructed, not destroyed, deconstructed approach to new modern devices coming out of Japan.
コントロールしきれるもんじゃないんですね、あれは。フィードバックなんで、本当にそのつまみとか。
It's this idea of embracing change, right?
音が変わってしま
You
う
can't control it. You have to embrace this uncontrollable nature of feedback as one would water, as one would wind, as one would nature.
そんなにフィードバックを元にしてそれを、こうなんて言うんでしょうね、ちょっと彫刻をするようにこうフィードバックを音楽に変えていくんですよ。だからコントロールが非常に難しくてちょっとしたことで音が。
So with no input, we are very, very gracefully, is he talking about, very slightly doing things to this deconstructed technology as a way of, showing that this music, this art can be alive. Feedback is alive. We are embracing these devices as a way that they are definitely not supposed to be used, creating a sound that we're not supposed to create. Feedback, right? And we are creating something completely new out of it that is uncontrollable at times, and one has to embrace that uncontrollability in order to create something entirely their own. There's really nothing like Onkyo music. There's really nothing like this this no input stuff, and we've talked about that. You guys should go back, watch the feedback lecture if you want to learn more about feedback. So really, to me, no input Onkyo music, the work of Nakamura, right? Nakamura, my bad. Toshimaru Nakamura, Sachiko M, and Atomo Yoshihide. What their work is really doing is bridging. To me, it's bridging old ideas with new devices, with newness. We are embracing the newness, specifically tech, in order to create something that can be defined by very old aesthetics. So this is, one way in which a new identity, a modern Japanese identity that is truly Japanese, that is truly not a Western push, but is also not an ancient push. It's something new, something 21st century, perhaps. This is where we're at now. It's really about seeking out all aesthetics, new and old, and trying to create something that is the amalgamation of our influences, as any artist should be doing. It's just Japan is a very unique place. This identity crisis, it's still ongoing. It's been less than 100 years since the dropping of the A bombs. These things, a lot of this stuff takes time. So basically, we're seeing, newness, oldness, destruction, embracing of oldness, the bridging of the two. All of the above, these are now on the table in the 21st century. But I hope that this encourages you guys to go and check out these different streams of Japanese avant-garde and really listen to it and compare it in relation to the ancient aesthetics that we talked about earlier. Appreciate you guys watching this little video lecture, all one take, baby. We're not doing any editing. I'm going to stop recording now, and you're going to watch it. Love y'all. See you later.